Welcome to the Spy Cops Info Podcast, a series on the secret undercover political police who infiltrated the lives of members of over 1,000 campaign and activist groups in the UK since 1968. Episode 24, Tilly Gifford and the Fight for a Scottish Inquiry.
The inquiry stops at the border. Like in Scotland, there is no recourse at all for finding out what happened, which spy cops were here, who they targeted.
Yeah.
And I know the inquiry is really limited and insufficient in England and Wales anyway, but in Scotland there's not even any veneer of a mechanism to access truth or clarity. So I wasn't eligible to be a core participant to the inquiry because I'm based in Scotland. And so my case got used as a way to try and be or like a gateway case to have an inquiry in Scotland, a proper inquiry into undercover policing in Scotland. And we had a judicial review that was in my name. And it was on the basis that I was one of the few rare instances that it was a recorded incident of undercover policing in Scotland, and that I had no access to the inquiry in England and Wales, and therefore Scotland needed to have its own inquiry. Yeah, it was a long and testing process. It was multiple years of us working on this as a legal case and as a campaign, it's called SCOPS, Scottish campaign opposing police surveillance. And what was really incredible, as the document from the undercover research group shows, is that it did unearth many instances of undercover policing in Scotland, beginning with in 1969 they were in Dunbartonshire spying on the International Marxist Group. And we know the Blacklist Support Group is massively overrepresented in terms of Scottish cases. And again, it's just absolutely devastating how these instances where there was definitely police involvement and collusion would have decimated working class lives. Working class men who were blacklisted their lives would be ruined, families have been ruined and destroyed by this. It leads to depression and alcoholism and things that destroy family and lives. And we know that there were multiple instances of this in Scotland, and it is shocking that there's no mechanism for an inquiry.
And just for people who don't know, so intelligence gathered by undercover police officers were passed on via probably the industrial desk at Special Branch onto the private firm who done the blacklisting, the consulting association.
Yeah, and so people involved with trade unions, people outspoken about the most basic worker rights, like access to toilets and facilities and better pay, anyone who's fighting. And I think it was mostly in the construction industry that it was found out. So that's one we know the most about. It might have been happening across many other industries, but in the construction industry,
I was just going to say there was a list of people who were not trade unionists as such, but environmentalists on one of the lists. People who were active, I think, in the mid to late 90s. They were also on the blacklist. And just to mention Dave Smith, who's probably one of the leading, if you like, inquiry campaigners. He's the trade unionist and secretary of the Blacklist support group. Hopefully interview him really soon, but you can also find his excellent statement on the inquiry website as well.
Yeah, so the undercover research group, and also through this process of campaigning, we did start to compile instances of undercover policing in Scotland. And when we went to see the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, or the Minister for Justice, Michael Matheson, at the time, we went to see him with people who had been targets of spy cops, to ask him what kind of mechanism would there be in Scotland. And he squirmed in his seat. It was pretty awkward. We went to see him with victims of spy cops and also their families. And they bought time by saying that they were going to commission a review, that the review is a stepping stone to decide as to whether they'd have an inquiry, and the review into undercover policing is what they would issue. That would be Scotland specific. Yes, and then a few years later, what year did the review come out? I think it's 2017 or 2018. They brought a review into undercover policing in Scotland, and it is absolutely shocking. Like, we know, so like the time span of it is like way less. We know that these secret units were operating since 1968, and the review just covers a few years back, and it doesn't even mention the state-sanctioned sexual abuse, which is the relationships of women and the institutional misogyny within that. It's not even mentioned. When we know that these is established, right, that these officers were doing this in Scotland, we know that on Scottish territory, we know this. And Carlo Neri was with his fiance Andrea. They were in Scotland often because their family were here. Like, there's well documented instances of this taking place in Scotland as well, and that wasn't even mentioned in the report. But also, they did this quite sneaky thing of amassing all these different themes. So they put in CHIS, or covert human intelligence sources, like information about that, on instances of drugs and trafficking. So they did quite a deliberate thing of amassing all these different themes, when we know from research that's been carried out around the inquiry that the groups from the left and to do with social change were disproportionately targeted, like things that were a threat to the status quo, and from leftist movements were the ones that were targeted. And they kind of put it all together with things which would be much more damnable, as it were. And obviously, there's also a bigger question about, do we need police? Do we need CHIS anyway? But that was definitely a tactical move to do that. So the report that they authored was totally pathetic and lacking and shocking. And also, why is the report being commissioned? Why are the police doing the report anyway? Why are the police marking their own homework? Like, why would you ask abusers to write their own report on what they've done? Like, that in itself, just in the very process of how they're doing it, is totally shocking. Like, that's no way to approach anything with any sense of justice. But also the co-authors of it, there was Stephen Whitelock, there was Gormley. Like, these people were like they were head of Strathclyde Police Special Branch. They were
you mentioned Gormley, Phil Gormley, because he became Chief Constable of Scotland. That's right, isn't he? But just around the time he was appointed, it came out. Well, it was when was he actually appointed? It was after the Spy Cops scandal broke, but we know that he was the officer in charge when the merger of Special Branch happened with Anti-Terrorism Branch around 2006. So this was like the end of the Special Demonstration Squad. So he oversaw that, and therefore we would have thought he would have been privy. At the time, we thought he would have been privy to that information. Now, as it turns out, in Kate Wilson's case, the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, see a variety of episodes we've done on this podcast about that. But Phil Gormley was often the senior officer signing off on Mark Kennedy's deployments and renewals of deployments, which is obviously given the fact that after that he was allowed to become Chief Constable of Scotland. You might think is shocking. Perhaps shocking is not the right word, because we're not really shocked by anything these days about this whole scandal, but appalling for sure.
Yeah, and so this HMICS report review, they called it, came out, and it was just such an insult to anyone who knows they're targeted, and it's clearly demonstrated that the Scottish government have absolutely no interest in being seriously accountable or in actually looking into what happened at all. And the fact not only that they got the police to investigate themselves, the fact that the main authors were all people who have been involved in running these spying units, like actively involved in it and making decisions in it and signing off on stuff. just makes it really deplorable. So that in legal terms, that's what they're using to stall it. So when we pushed to have an inquiry in Scotland, the legal representatives for England and Wales said that we were too late, that we'd already missed the deadline by which we could contest it and have a judicial review. And in Scotland, they said, you're too early, you can't contest it because we're still deciding if we're going to have an inquiry or not. So that was also how it was really stalled and drawn out. And then they brought out the review, which was really lacking and offensive and insufficient. And then the Scottish Legal Aid Board was really reluctant the whole way through. It was a massive battle for them to fund the case, to keep it going. Very easy to argue that that's a political decision, that they didn't want this case to be heard. And so we had to crowdfund. We used crowd justice and crowdfunded enough money to have the first part of it heard in court to evaluate whether the case had merits or not. And one thing that was amazing about the crowd justice page, and of course it's really intimidating, no one wants to put their face and name out there in this context. But what was really beautiful, and it was made up of people putting in a $5 or a $10 at a time, and all the comments, from people who'd been affected by the blacklisting, people who'd been affected by undercover policing. Actually, that was really galvanizing to have this plethora of voices, people being nice one, this is why it matters. Inadvertently, actually, I think that gave us all a lot of energy. The financial support, but the comments alongside it, was really galvanizing. And then we funded the first part of the court case, and the case did have merits, and so then it was brought on to the next phase of it. And then it was argued in court that the case was one of personal interest, that it wasn't eligible for further Scottish Legal Aid Board funding because it was a case of personal interest for myself to find out who these, we had to push it. We wanted to find out who these 2 undercover police were who were following me, but obviously it's about people whose lives have been decimated by being on the blacklist. It's about women who've had their whole worlds turned upside down by finding out that they'd been duped into these really traumatic and horrifically manipulative relationships. It's about potential children who've been fathered who deserve to know their background story. It's to do with whole campaigns and trade unionists and people fighting for a better future who have had their whole networks damaged. And you need to know what happened and understand what happened. And also what seems really fundamental too is there's no opportunity to have any safeguards in place, right? So it's not just to know what happened, it's that we can't demand safeguards and demand an end to these practices if they're not brought to light. And so it's kind of like chicken and egg. The Scottish government well, you don't need an inquiry because there's never been any instances of undercover policing in Scotland, is what they're saying. It hasn't happened here. There is no evidence. And if you don't release cover names, or if we don't know which groups are targeted, people are never going to come forward and say that they were potentially affected by it. And therefore, we can't have any clarity shone on it, and therefore we can't have any safeguards that will protect us from it. It's still going on. It will still go on.
I was just going to add a little bit of context for people, because although the inquiry is mainly, and it will be mainly, about 2 units based, the Special Demonstration Squad and later the MPIOU. If you look, one of the latter modules is supposed to investigate other units who may or may not have deployed undercover police officers. So that would include, for instance, special branch units, not only outside of the Metropolitan Police area, but say Lancashire Police. We believe that there was definitely at least one undercover, a guy called Tony Robertson, not the guy who played Baldrick in Blackadder, but another Tony Robertson, who seemed to be working independently but also going undercover there. So had the inquiry been extended to Scotland, then we would have heard about, say, for instance, undercover police who were directly attached to the various forces there, Strathclyde or whoever.
Yeah, so finally, so we ran the case for as long as it could, pushing for this judicial review in the Court of Session in Edinburgh, and then finally, due to them not funding the next part of the case, and it could have been a gamble. We could have tried to fundraise for the next leg of it, and then after we passed that hurdle, maybe because we know that there's traction in the arguments we have, like we know that, but I think the effort it was and the resources it was taking to get it over the next hurdle, we decided, to draw it to a close for then. But I know one, it's really important that it is recorded in history that there were voices, like people are not content with this absolute lack of an inquiry in Scotland. So so it's really important that you sorry go over it. Yeah, it feels really important that there's at least a trace of that, but also we know that it will be picked up. Like it definitely will be picked up. Like we will find out in the fullness of time. It will become unraveled, like who was affected and in what ways, and someone, maybe other people will pick it up where we left it for sure.
Absolutely, it's definitely. I mean, it's. I think it would just. I mean, we're not sure what's going to happen when they get eventually, whenever that is, they get to, if like the era of the National Public Intelligence Order Unit, in terms of what happens when, for instance, we get to the G8 in Scotland.
Yeah, yeah, and we know for sure that the local police forces at the time of the G8 would have had to have signed off on the spy cops from the Met being up here as well. As in that there's so many different ways to follow, but it's completely implausible. Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, not just the males. Wasn't it how many German undercovers? They say there's loads, and presumably that meant there would have been loads from. There would have been others from different countries as well, Italy, France, whatever. In addition to that,
Yeah. Yeah, and it's completely implausible for them to claim that they were oblivious to all of this. Like they would have
yeah,
been
I mean,
signing
you
off
would
on
have.
these
Yeah, they
things.
should have had sight of the officers, as they, to use their phrase. I guess they would have known. They should have known, especially obviously. I mean, at that point. Yeah. Anyway, so I'll ramble on a bit, but yeah. So, is there anything else you want to say on that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to note the context in 2009 when I was targeted. When it came out as a story, everyone was like shocked and aghast and amazed that this could happen and all of these things. And I think it's really interesting how there's a cultural shift when the spy cops scandal broke. And before that, if you were moving in circles where you knew this kind of thing is happening, would be happening, you'd kind of be called a conspiracy theorist a lot. And people are like, yeah, you might think it's happening, but like really, like not. And then there's this cultural shift, which I think is really interesting. And then around the time of the Lush campaign, which was what 2 years ago, so Lush, the high street shop, took on the campaign around spy cops, and they had to remove all their material. Their staff were getting aggressed, and their windows were getting. And I just
Yeah, there was a
find
lot
it
of
really
intimidation by the police to on various branches. I know in Cardiff they had to. I think they were sort of browbeaten into taking the stuff out of the window.
yeah intimidation by the police, but also just from people on the high street. I think it's a really interesting kind of like temperature gauge that people are really not ready for this kind of fairy tale of like the good copper and the police to be to be challenged, or people it runs deep. It runs deep essentially, and people felt super threatened by the myth or the fairy tale of the good copper being really pulled into question so visibly. And they had to really rapidly and urgently withdraw all their campaigning materials. So as well, I just find these like interesting markers in time. Like when my case happened, it was like, really, they're doing this, so shocking. And then there was a spy cops case. But then when you push it a bit further and actually put it on the high street, the general public is still really kind of not up for it. There's still so much work to do to really have an intelligent critique around the police, I
Oh,
find.
definitely. It's definitely a
Yeah.
big. I mean, people don't want to believe that the people that have power over them are corrupt in a variety of different
Mhm.
different ways. It's a real big thing. I mean, because I suppose I looked into this quite a lot in terms of like because I suppose because I grew up in a council estate where the attitude to the police was pretty negative, and that's what I grew up with. So I was kind of slightly shocked how like most of the population seemed to think the police were great. But I think, I mean, as I say, I think it's a kind of like people want to believe in the police because they have the power over them, and it's a real big psychological hurdle to get over. I think recent events, especially around the murder of Everard and stuff. I mean, it's hard to say how deep the impact is on of these events. I'd like to think it is in some way transformative, but I don't know.
Yeah, and like I guess it was just quite an amazing experience to start from that point of departure and then be privy to standing in solidarity with so many amazing people and testimonies, either from women who are affected or from workers. And I think that is the work that we also need to do, is to really intertwine to make a fabric of, like, I think that's the work that is there for us to do, is to reach out to other movements and other generations that could have been effective and have a more coherent kind of fabric and sense of who was affected and how, so that we can really come forward and be like, this has happened and we need an inquiry. Like, it's not, this position of having no inquiry in Scotland is insufficient.
It's been great speaking to you. Is there anything else you want to add within that context? Oh, one of the things I was going to mention, I might slot this in somewhere else in the interview, so it's a bit out because it's a bit out of time. Is that I'm aware that because obviously you're involved with Plain Stupid, and I think the year before, I think if you like, in the London branch of Plain Stupid, there was a corporate spy exposed, kind of a bit of a laughable one called Toby Kendall.
Yeah, I was just yeah, I wasn't in that group in London, but I was in Scotland. But yeah, I was around for the Toby. Yeah, so that bit of story was amazing. That story is really amazing, but also so the instance, so that was Gordon Irving who actually sent an email to the wrong person, and Gordon Irving was the ex head of Special Branch or Strathclyde Special Branch. So it's a really, really interesting instance of the revolving door, right, between the industries. So Gordon Irving was head of Strathclyde Special Branch, and then when he retired, he became the head of security for Scottish Power. And then he got found and embarrassed for hiring a private security company called Vericola with Rebecca Todd, who was in it. He was targeting environmental groups. But also we had the list of groups that they were targeting. It was, the pretense that they were just targeting direct action groups is totally laughable. Like, the range is just huge. It's just a massive industry of like data collecting and profiling. A lot of these private security companies are staffed by ex-police. So there's loads of nepotism. They've got the methods.
Yeah.
Mark Stone went on to create his own private security company, still using his identity as an undercover, but then just for working for his own private company. And as well, I think it's really important to keep an eye of, the police outsourcing their dirty work to a private company so that they're not bound by the same standards or accountability. And actually it's the same people, the same methods. It is also really sinister. Like, really what they're doing as officers with some presumed, like some expected accountability, is so so shocking and revolting, like so vile. And you can imagine that, like, when they're then opening their own private security, their own private companies, and the police could be outsourcing their dirty work in even less accountable ways. It's really important to be aware as well of this revolving door, and there's many instances of it. Yeah, and also Scotland trying to wash their hands of this and be like, there's no need for an inquiry, there's nothing to see here. We know that Bob Lambert then had a career in teaching at St Andrews University in Scotland, and like, we know these people then go on to actually like shape our culture through all these other institutions. Yeah, I think as well, looking at the general culture of misogyny and trust in the state, and seeing how these people who did these absolutely revolting things just get job upgrades and then go to train more people to do it. Like this whole chat of like, as one rogue police officer, like really isn't fly. And we know that now. Like we know there's the tradecraft manual, and we know that they were then in senior positions after doing these really disgusting things, like training other people to do the same thing, and that they were admired for it. But that I think it's also really important to trace these people to the cultural institutions and the spaces they then occupy, to really understand that it's a general culture that we need to call out and challenge.
Thanks, Tilly, so much for that. For more information and to find all the previous episodes, visit spycops.info. Please help support the podcast by liking or subscribing or sharing or reviewing or donating or anything really. Cheers.